I'm Frederick Lauren, and I've rented the house on Haunted Hill tonight so that my wife can give a party. A haunted house party. She's so amusing. There'll be food and drink and ghosts, and perhaps even a few murders. You're all invited.
Okay, an interesting way to think about it is that the places that are good for telling ghost stories accumulate ghost stories. So a brightly lit room is not going to do it. You know, you're not going to be able to create the mood in the story that you want reflected with the storytelling. So it helps to isolate things, to isolate people, for one thing. This is a reason why, you know, out in the woods around a campfire, you feel alone, but there's the possibility of being intruded upon.
Attics, basements, unheated. Those are places where you see ghosts. Or perhaps in the forest where it's chilly and away from people, you might see a ghost.
The setting contributes to making the people feel like they're in the story and feel like the story's possible.
A really well-told story takes you there.
And it was as if his words released her, and she flew at him, and her arms reached out and grabbed him by the lapels of his black coat. She was so close, he could smell her. She smelled of earth and long ago death. And he saw those eye sockets empty but glowing with blue light. He saw the skin so removed that she couldn't speak. And yet, words began to come from her, not from her mouth, but from around her. And she began to tell him her story. She told of how she'd loved a man and how he hadn't loved her. He'd only wanted her money. And how he'd killed her and buried her down in the cellar when she wouldn't tell him where her money was. And oh, preacher, she said, won't you dig me up? Give me a proper Christian burial so that I can rest in peace. And the preacher was able to just nod, yes. And so she continued, well, before you bury me, break off a bit of my pinky bone and put that in the collection plate this Sunday morning, and you will know who murdered me.
And on the first day of move-in, I was on my 5th or 6th trip, and as I was coming back down the attic, the way the attic worked is there were stairs that led up to a landing, so you couldn't really see the doorway out of the attic once you were up there. I was going to head back down to the stairs, or back down to the door, and as I got to the top of the stairs that led to the exit, at the bottom, silhouetted against the doorway, I saw just sort of a blackened figure. I assumed female, there was a feminine look to it. It was just a shadowy sort of outline. And I saw that and I panicked and I sort of fell and scooted back away from the doorway. So after a couple seconds, I got my courage up and poked my head up over and everything was fine. So I scurried back down out of the attic and I didn't see anything there again for the rest of the day. So I assumed all was well. A couple months later, I was up in the attic again, reading comics, because that's where all my comics were. And I was going to leave, and I saw the same figure, only this time it was about halfway up the stairs. And that really freaked me out, because before I could lose sight of it, I had to back up considerably further and hunch down extra low, which was my first priority. I don't want to look at it anymore.
Every time I go to a school or a library or a park and I'm going to tell stories to a group, especially if it's children, but even adults, no matter what time of year it is, they say, oh, tell us a scary one, tell us a ghost story.
We tell ghost stories because we love to be scared. People love to be scared.
And I think that people want that. People want the shiver. I mean, they do, and I think they want it in their religious life, and I think they want it in their popular entertainment as well.
You know, when you're given a good scare, your heart beats faster, you get a kind of a pump of adrenaline, your hair may stand up on end. You know, we have these physiological reactions to being frightened.
And even if it doesn't fit in with the rest of the way they think about the world, it can be deeply pleasurable. At the same time, it can be deeply terrifying.
And that Sunday, he put that little bit of dried bone in the middle of this heavy gold plate with that velvet in the middle. And there it lay, a bit of dry bone. And yet, when he passed it back and forth amongst his congregation, nobody seemed to notice. Nobody commented on it. They just put their money in, as they always did, and passed it to the next person. Round and round it went, until it came to a man that nobody really knew. He was always alone. And he too reached into his pocket and brought out a small, small coin. And as he was about to put that into the plate, that bit of bone leapt out of the plate and began to dig itself into the back of his hand. It began to embed itself in the back of the flesh of his hand. And it was so painful and excruciating, he began to scream and yell and draw attention to himself, and he tried to pry that bit of bone out of the back of his hand. But as it got deeper, it seemed to take over his body. And there in front of everyone, he began to confess. He told of how he hadn't really loved her, how he'd only really wanted her money, and how he'd killed her and buried her down in the cellar, and how he wasn't sorry, but only wanted the pain to stop.
The living room already had its own entity, but it was pretty innocuous, and we called it Ghost Cat. The first time we heard it was really early after moving in, and we already had a cat Tiger, but we heard the sounds of another cat coming from within the wall, just a polite little meow. We're like, oh. It's a damn cat in the wall. And I figured that was possible because Tiger had gotten into the crawl space in the attic and gone all over the place, you know, and come out covered in soot. So I thought it was definitely possible that we got a cat in there. So we put some food and water in the attic to try to lure it out. And every now and then we would hear the cat. And we just thought there was nothing we could do for it. I was like, man, I'm just gonna have a dead cat in the wall sooner or later. But then we started to hear the cat make sounds not specifically in the wall, just in the living room. We'd hear a meow from a corner, and Tiger would look over there, and like, what? He was angry and cranky. He didn't want another cat to be there. You would feel it jump on the couch. You would hear it scratching the walls, weird stuff like that. It's like, great. Now I got independent confirmation that there's a ghost cat living in my walls. But it became just sort of an interesting, cute thing. People came over to visit, and they'd hear something. Like, that's Ghost Cat. He's harmless. You know, I don't have to feed him. I don't have to clean the litter box. He's just there.
When my nephew was 16, he was killed in a car accident. I was away from home at the time. I lived in Bloomington. And a couple years after that, my 10-year-old niece, who had been sick from birth, died. And one weekend I was visiting my parents in French Lick and sitting on the bed reading a book and playing with my cat. And I looked up and my nephew was standing beside the bed. And he was holding my niece in his arms. And he said, excuse me. He said, it's okay, I'm not alone anymore.
The particular variety of ghost story that we have, there are different facets to it, and one of the facets is that if someone exists as a ghost, they were taken before their time.
I bet if you looked at ghost stories in general, most ghosts are still here because some harm has been done to them, and they're trying, or they did harm, and they're trying to clear the air or get something figured out before they move on.
If you look at our ghost stories, so many of them are about the memory of violence in a place that continues to act out itself again and again.
This is what she used on my brother and her sister. Hacked them to pieces. We found parts of the bodies all over the house, in places you wouldn't think. The funny thing is the heads have never been found.
I think we want to think that the events that we live through affect the places that we live in a way that's very fundamental. That we don't want to think that I can suffer a tragedy on a place and that place is the same after that tragedy as before. We want to, I think, and it's a hopeful rejection of the Enlightenment materialism, that suffering a traumatic event in a place marks that place somehow, and it continues to be hallowed or sacred or tragic. Even if it's tragic and horrible, it contains something that it didn't have before because our presence changed the environment. I think we want to think that something survives.
If you believe in an afterlife, then you are comforted by the fact that you will meet them again in a different place.
The embodiment of the spirit that lingers after death. Well, it's pretty difficult to prove this, even though people even today try.
And I think ghost stories are an attempt to prove that there is something after death. And I think people find them more more credible because they don't want to give up completely.
And it's part of what we do as storytelling creatures to help figure things out.
And then limp, he just stopped his confession. And two men from the congregation, one on either side, helped him out of the church, down to the judge, where he was convicted of murder. Soon after, he was hung by the neck until dead. It wasn't long after that that the preacher went back to that house to see if she had moved on, if the house was free of her spirit. Well, when he walked through the house, she did seem to be gone. He saw nothing of her, but just as he was passing the fireplace, he began to hear her voice. Her voice was there, in the air, all around him. And she thanked him for what he'd done. And she did say that she could rest in peace. And she said that her money was there, right there, under the hearthstones. He should dig them up and use that money that had caused so much ill. He should use it for good in the community. And he did.
It's almost as if we're wired to use story, to teach each other, to maintain a history.
But they also help warn us about things or teach us about things to be wary of. I mean, how many times have we heard the story and we've said, oh, don't do that character. We're all worried if we wouldn't do it, but they're going to do it. And through that, mistake or misstep that the character's making, we can learn something.
The inability to deal with death. Americans have a real hard time dealing with death. All of these things, I think, contribute to making ghost stories the most popular oral narrative in America.
And so folklore and legends in particular are a combination of things that are fixed and things that vary. And in the fixity, we can see that there are commonalities just to being human. And that's great. But in the variation, we can see that we're all unique, we're all interesting as individuals, as groups of people, as whole countries.
So in a way, for us to remain a coherent culture, we had to tell stories to maintain our sense of identity, to learn from the past, and to have an idea of where we were going.
It introduces us to other people's worldviews, to other people who believe things that we don't believe and have experiences we don't experience. And it does so, and this is the best part about it, is it does so in a way that we can comprehend if we pay attention.